What if history's most feared regime wasn't just evil, but also deeply, catastrophically stupid? Behind the uniforms, behind the horror, was a house of cards built on arrogance, bad math, and delusions of genius. This isn't a story about how the Nazis rose. It's about how they fumbled their way into collapse. From sabotaging their own scientists to losing wars they could have avoided, these are the 33 dumbest decisions that helped end the Third Reich. Not with a bang, but with a long, bitter unraveling of their own making. Welcome to the downfall, engineered by themselves. Before we dive in, if you love deep dives into the strange, the dark, and the downright disastrous, hit subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight? Lunch break? Hiding from responsibility? We see you. Let's get into it. 1. Invading the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, 1941. June 22, 1941. At precisely 3:15 a.m., Germany made the most ambitious military move in its history, launching Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler thought it would take a few weeks, maybe 2 months. Blitzkrieg, but make it Slavic. The plan? Smash the Red Army, decapitate the communist regime, and plunder Russia's vast resources like a kid raiding a candy store. What could go wrong? Everything. In their arrogance, the Nazis mistook Stalin's purges for weakness and the Red Army's initial disarray as permanent. But what they triggered was not collapse. It was metamorphosis. Soviet industry moved east of the Urals. Millions of Russians dug in. Hitler had kicked in the door expecting the whole rotten structure to fall. Instead, he woke up a sleeping colossus with frostbite, factory grease, and a grudge. It was supposed to be a knockout punch. It became the beginning of Germany's slow strangulation. And what made it worse? They had no idea what the Soviet engine was really capable of. 2. Underestimating Soviet industrial capacity. You can almost hear the sound of German generals choking on their own assumptions. As panzers raced across Ukrainian plains, Nazi planners still believed victory was inevitable. What they didn't see, because they weren't looking, was the silent exodus of Soviet factories heading east. Thousands of machines dismantled and loaded onto trains, vanishing into the endless Siberian interior like ghosts. By the time the Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow, the USSR had already rebuilt a war industry behind the Urals, out of bomber range, out of German imagination. They didn't just recover, they exploded. The Red Army began receiving tanks, guns, and aircraft in quantities Germany could barely comprehend. The T-34 rolled off production lines like loaves of bread. The USSR could afford to lose entire cities. Germany couldn't afford to lose fuel. The Germans thought they were playing chess. The Soviets were building the board. And just when Berlin realized it, another industrial monster was entering the game. And just like that, Germany had awakened a war machine it couldn't outrun or outproduce. Speaking of machines, if you're into long-form breakdowns of history's most baffling failures, now's a good time to subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And while you're here, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it on your end? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this late-night rabbit hole really goes. 3. Declaring war on the United States, 1941. December 11th, 1941. 4 days after Pearl Harbor. Hitler did something no strategist with a functioning frontal lobe would recommend. He declared war on the United States, unprovoked. America had not declared war on Germany. Congress wasn't even sure it wanted to. But Hitler, ever the gambler, leapt into the abyss like it owed him money. Why? Because he thought America was too soft, too multicultural, too consumerist to fight a real war. What he got was the world's largest economy pivoting overnight into the most efficient war machine in human history. Ford stopped making cars and started making B-24 bombers. Coca-Cola set up bottling plants in combat zones. And within 2 years, American troops, Bullets and bombers were swarming across two oceans like clockwork with machine guns. The Third Reich had just invited an enemy it couldn't outproduce, outfight, or outlast. And if that wasn't enough, they were also still refusing to do the one thing that might have helped: plan rationally. 4. Ignoring logistics in favor of ideology. German military doctrine was full of maps, arrows, and dreams of Aryan destiny. But fuel gauges? Not so much. The Wehrmacht was a tactical marvel, fast, lethal, and utterly dependent on fuel, spare parts, and functioning supply lines, which they didn't have. Why? Because the regime wasn't run by logisticians. It was run by ideologues. Trucks broke down. Tanks ran out of fuel. Horse-drawn carts hauled artillery in a war that was supposed to be mechanized. German armies starved while chasing fantasies of racial domination across the steppes. Supplies meant for frontline troops were diverted to support SS terror squads in the rear. Why bother planning for winter boots when you're planning for ethnic cleansing? The Nazi high command wasn't just evil, it was inefficient. Bureaucracy, infighting, and delusions turned their war machine into a rusting parade of stranded vehicles and frostbitten soldiers. And speaking of frostbite. 5. Failing to prepare for winter warfare. Napoleon could have warned them, but Hitler wasn't much for reading history, unless it was his own rewriting of it. When the Eastern Front turned white, the Germans turned blue. Quite literally. Their soldiers were wearing summer uniforms in sub-zero temperatures. Engines froze. Guns jammed. Oil thickened into sludge. Fingers snapped like twigs. It wasn't just incompetence. It was denial. Hitler had refused to believe the war would last into winter. Logistics officers who requested winter gear were reprimanded for defeatism. The Red Army, meanwhile, was not only dressed for the apocalypse, it was armed with skis, sleds, and Mongolian cavalry. Germany had built a military for speed. Now it was stuck in a snowdrift. Thousands froze. Others were picked off by Soviet counterattacks launched under the cover of blizzards and white camouflage. The Eastern Front became a graveyard of arrogance. And the man most responsible for freezing the war effort solid? He was just getting started with his micromanaging brilliance. 6. Hitler taking direct military control. By 1942, Adolf Hitler no longer saw his generals as advisors. He saw them as underperforming interns. Tired of being questioned, he appointed himself strategic mastermind and began issuing direct orders from his bunker, most of which made about as much sense as assigning a poet to build a tank. Retreats? Forbidden. Repositioning? Cowardice. Flexibility? Un-German. The result? Encirclements, collapsed fronts, and armies trapped in cities with no supply lines and no exit strategy. Hitler's infamous no-retreat orders turned battles into mass graves, especially on the Eastern Front, where entire divisions were swallowed by Soviet pincers while Berlin scribbled fantasy maps. Even seasoned commanders like Manstein and Guderian were reduced to obedient stenographers, watching their carefully laid plans sabotaged by a man who once failed art school. Strategy became delusion. Orders were based on ideology, not terrain. War turned into theater, and Hitler insisted on directing every scene. But nowhere was this obsession with symbolism more fatal than in a certain industrial city by a certain river. 7. Obsession with symbolic cities. Stalingrad. Stalingrad was not just a city. It was an ego trap. A Soviet city with Stalin's name on it? Hitler couldn't resist. Logic said bypass it. Hitler said bury it. What started as a strategic move to secure oil fields turned into a prestige duel between two dictators with inferiority complexes and endless manpower. The battle became a black hole. German troops fought block by block, factory by factory, warehouse by warehouse. Supplies ran low. Winter came again. The Red Army encircled the entire German Sixth Army. But Hitler, true to form, ordered them to stay put. They obeyed. And they died. Stalingrad shattered the illusion of German invincibility. It wasn't just a defeat. It was a collapse in morale, strategy, and myth. An entire army gone. Not because it had to be, but because one man couldn't stand the idea of backing down. And why was that army left hanging there anyway? Because the rest of the German forces were off chasing too many objectives at once. 8. Splitting forces. Between Moscow, Leningrad, and the Caucasus, Germany had a powerful military, but not an infinite one. And instead of choosing a clear, singular objective in the Soviet Union, Hitler chose 3: Moscow, Leningrad, and the oil-rich Caucasus, simultaneously. Because why be focused when you can be overextended? The result was diluted power, scattered logistics, and half-finished victories. No city fell completely. No region was stabilized. Every advance stalled. Every army was too small for the job it was given. And by the time reinforcements could be moved, Soviet counterattacks had already begun. Leningrad endured. Moscow held. The Caucasus became a death trap. Germany's decision to attack everywhere meant it won nowhere. The Soviet Union, wounded but unbroken, used every delay to dig in deeper and push back harder. But what was the grand goal of going south anyway? It wasn't just territory. It was something even more vital, something liquid, something Germany never had enough of. 9. Failure to secure oil supplies early. The Third Reich didn't run on ideology. It ran on fuel. Or at least, it tried to. Germany had no significant oil reserves of its own, and from the very beginning, the entire war effort depended on imported or captured fuel. The push toward the Caucasus wasn't just strategic, it was desperate. Without oil, tanks stop, planes don't fly. Blitzkrieg becomes a slow crawl. But the Caucasus was far, mountainous, and well defended. German forces got close, but not close enough. And while they chased Soviet oil, they burned through their own. Hitler never made the oil fields a first priority in 1941 when they might have been taken. By the time he did in 1942, it was too late. Fuel shortages haunted the Reich like a ghost. Planes sat on runways. Panzers were abandoned. Even retreat became impossible. Germany had built a mechanized war machine without securing the one thing it needed to move. And speaking of high-tech wonders that never quite delivered, 10. Delaying the Mi-262 jet as a fighter. By 1944, Germany had one of the world's first operational jet aircraft, the Messerschmitt Mi-262. It was fast, deadly, and capable of outrunning anything the Allies had in the sky. This was Germany's chance to contest Allied air dominance. The Mi-262 could have been a game-changer. So what did Hitler do? He insisted the jet be used as a bomber. A fighter interceptor that could have torn through bomber formations was instead burdened with bombs and sent after ground targets. Production was delayed. Pilots were undertrained. Factories were bombed before enough jets could be built. And by the time Mi-262s appeared in real numbers, the Allies already owned the skies. It was a technological miracle squandered by a dictator obsessed with offense at all costs. In the hands of competent planners, it could have bought Germany time. Instead, it became another what-if lost in the ruins. And the irony? The very minds who could have built more of these breakthroughs had already been kicked out. 11. Persecuting and expelling Jewish scientists. Germany once had some of the greatest scientific minds on Earth. Physicists, chemists, mathematicians, many of them Jewish, or inconveniently not Aryan enough for Nazi standards. The regime's solution? Fire them, harass them, strip their citizenship, send them packing. And so they left, fleeing to Britain, to America, and to the very countries Germany would soon be at war with. Among them were figures like Albert Einstein, Leo Szilard, and Edward Teller, men who would go on to contribute to radar, encryption, and, in the most dramatic twist of all, the Manhattan Project. In their ideological purge, the Nazis gutted their own intellectual class. Scientific research stalled. Innovation slowed. Ideas that could have helped Germany survive, jets, rocketry, nuclear research, were mismanaged, delayed, or mishandled. All because loyalty mattered more than genius. The brain drain was self-inflicted, and while Nazi science marched backwards, one of their key enemies was sprinting forward in a very different technological race. 12. Ignoring radar and defensive air technology. You'd think a nation planning to wage total war against modern air powers might invest in detecting enemy aircraft. But the Nazis had other priorities, mostly ideological and explosive. As Britain quietly built a web of radar stations along its coast, the Germans scoffed. They saw it as irrelevant, unmanly, technocratic nonsense. That nonsense would become one of the decisive factors in the Battle of Britain. While the RAF scrambled planes with minutes to spare, thanks to radar detection, the Luftwaffe was flying blind. German aircraft took heavier losses, missed key targets, and found themselves outmaneuvered in what should have been a one-sided air campaign. Worse still, Germany's own radar development was delayed and disorganized. By the time they began catching up, Allied bombing campaigns were already underway, devastating German industry and morale. The skies were lost, and with them the chance to invade the one enemy that refused to surrender. 13. Losing the Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1940, Germany had a window, brief, brutal, and vanishing fast, to take Britain out of the war. The Luftwaffe outnumbered the RAF. The British were still reeling from Dunkirk. An invasion was risky, but not impossible. All it required was air superiority. They didn't get it. RAF pilots, many of them barely out of training, flew endless sorties. But they weren't alone. They had radar. They had ground coordination. And they were fighting over their own home turf. Every downed pilot could be back in a cockpit the next day. German pilots weren't so lucky. By October, the Luftwaffe had failed to break the RAF. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was quietly shelved. Hitler turned his attention east, believing Britain would simply fade from the war. It didn't. It became a launch pad, a base, a thorn. And the more Germany failed to take it, the more it relied on a new strategy, one driven by rage, not reason. 14. Switching bombing strategy to civilian terror. Frustrated by their inability to crush the RAF, the Nazis changed tactics. Instead of hitting airfields and radar stations, they turned to bombing civilian cities, especially London. The idea was simple: break morale, force surrender, and show the British population who really ran Europe. It backfired. The Blitz didn't cow the British, it hardened them. Civilians slept in subways, carried on with daily life, and adapted to nightly raids. Meanwhile, the RAF regained strength, repaired airfields, and brought more squadrons into the fight. The shift in bombing strategy had handed Britain the breathing room it needed. Even Churchill seemed to grow stronger under fire. The very act of trying to demoralize a nation ended up rallying it instead. But Nazi strategy had always favored fear over finesse, and that same brutality would soon be unleashed on the territories they did manage to conquer, at an immense cost to themselves. 15. Treating occupied populations brutally. When German forces rolled into Eastern Europe, many locals welcomed them, not out of love, but out of hatred for Stalin. Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians. Some saw the Germans as liberators, or at least as the lesser evil. It could have been a strategic gift. Instead, the Nazis turned opportunity into catastrophe. Occupation was not about partnership, it was about dominance. Repression, mass arrests, forced labor, and racial policies crushed any hope of cooperation. Villages were razed. Intellectuals and community leaders were targeted. entire populations were treated as subhuman obstacles, and what could have been allies became enemies. Resistance movements grew. Partisans ambushed German patrols, sabotaged supply lines, and tied down entire divisions that could have been used elsewhere. The Nazis didn't just occupy, they provoked. And in doing so, they created enemies behind every tree. But the real tragedy? Even groups that were anti-Soviet were pushed into the arms of the Red Army, thanks to one more blunder rooted in ideological blindness. 16. Alienating anti-Soviet groups. Few things in war are more valuable than willing locals. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, it stumbled upon a rare moment. Entire populations, Ukrainians, Balts, Cossacks, who despised Stalin enough to initially welcome the invaders. Here was a once-in-a-century strategic advantage. Ready-made collaborators who knew the terrain, the language, and the enemy. But the Nazis, drunk on racial ideology, threw it away. Instead of winning hearts and leveraging these populations, the Nazis labeled them inferior. Locals were brutalized, villages torched, and any dream of autonomy crushed. The Wehrmacht could have gained tens of thousands of motivated recruits and guides. Instead, they inspired resistance. What began as cautious cooperation turned into open rebellion. Partisans grew stronger, sabotage became endemic, and with each act of repression, Germany turned potential allies into enemies, while stretching itself thinner on the front. And once those enemies started pushing back, Hitler made sure no German soldier was allowed to back out. 17. Refusing tactical retreats. In military terms, a tactical retreat is a way to live to fight another day. But in Hitler's world, retreat was treason, a moral weakness punishable by annihilation. As Soviet forces began launching powerful counteroffensives in late 1942, German commanders often requested permission to fall back, regroup, or establish better defensive lines. The answer was always the same: hold your position, at all costs. The result was tragedy disguised as discipline. German units were left encircled and destroyed, not because they were outmatched, but because they weren't allowed to move. This wasn't strategy. It was stubbornness set in concrete. Entire divisions vanished in pockets like Demyansk, Korsun, and later in the Kessel of Stalingrad. Experienced officers who suggested retreat were sidelined or punished. The Wehrmacht became frozen, literally and figuratively, in place. Meanwhile, behind the lines, the Allies were learning everything, not by spies or fortune-telling, but by something far more embarrassing. 18. Underestimating Allied codebreaking. German communications were encrypted by the famous Enigma machine, an engineering marvel, constantly recoded, supposedly unbreakable. German high command was so confident in its security that they transmitted detailed operational plans, convoy routes, and unit movements without hesitation. What they didn't know was that the Allies had been reading their mail for years. British and Polish cryptanalysts had cracked Enigma early on, and by the middle of the war, Ultra, the name for the decrypted intelligence, was flowing daily into Allied command centers. Naval convoys rerouted, U-boats hunted, attacks preempted. Germany was fighting an enemy who often knew their next move before they made it. But the Nazis never suspected a thing. They changed codes occasionally, but never fully grasped that their encrypted world was an open book. Arrogance made them blind. And even when they did innovate, the results often looked impressive, until they broke down in the mud. 19. Overengineering weapons systems. German engineering was legendary, and that was the problem. Where the Allies built thousands of rugged, easy-to-maintain tanks and rifles, Germany created temperamental masterpieces. The Tiger tank, for example, could take out multiple Shermans, assuming it didn't break down first. Its parts were rare, its fuel consumption absurd, and production numbers pitiful. The same logic applied across the board. From rifles to rockets, German weapons were often overcomplicated, late to arrive, or impossible to maintain under field conditions. Factories were overloaded with prototypes. Units waited months for spare parts. Maintenance crews struggled with machinery designed more for museum shelves than muddy trenches. Form triumphed over function, and it cost lives. Meanwhile, the Allies, mass-producing weapons by the thousands, won wars with numbers, not nuance. But the real kicker? Germany didn't even put its economy on a full war footing until it was already too late. 20. Failing to fully mobilize the economy until too late. Total war requires total commitment. But throughout the early years of World War II, Germany still operated as if it were peacetime, at least on the home front. Civilian production continued. Luxury items were made. The economy wasn't fully converted for war until 1943, by which point the tide was already turning. Why the delay? Part of it was Hitler's desire to keep German civilians comfortable, shielding them from the realities of the war. Part was bureaucratic chaos, competing agencies, overlapping jurisdictions, ideological favoritism. And part was simply arrogance, the belief that victory was inevitable and mass mobilization unnecessary. It took the rise of Albert Speer to begin reorganizing German war production, but by then, it was a race against time. Allied bombs were falling, Soviet tanks were rolling. Germany had lost the window when full mobilization might have changed the outcome. And the reason the economy was such a mess? Look no further than the regime's love for internal chaos. 21. Rival power structures within the regime. Inside the Nazi regime, coordination was considered a weakness. Instead of a streamlined command structure, Hitler built a government of rival fiefdoms, each loyal to him but hostile to each other. The SS, the Wehrmacht, the Nazi Party bureaucracy, the Foreign Office, the Gestapo, Goering's Luftwaffe, Himmler's security empire, and Goebbels' propaganda machine all competed for influence, money, and credit. Cooperation was discouraged. Chaos was rewarded. This wasn't accidental. It was by design. Hitler believed that rivalry kept his underlings loyal, but in practice, it meant duplication, sabotage, and dysfunction. Supply chains were snarled by competing claims. Intelligence was hoarded, distorted, or ignored. War strategy became a series of feuds in uniform. When everything depends on a single charismatic dictator and his lieutenants are encouraged to stab each other in the back, what you get isn't a war machine. You get a paranoid circus, and the ringmaster wasn't hiring based on competence. 22. Appointing loyalists over competent leaders. What do you get when you replace seasoned professionals with unqualified loyalists? You get Nazi Germany's leadership structure. In the Third Reich, loyalty trumped talent. Military appointments, ministerial roles, and key command positions were often handed out not based on expertise, but on ideological purity and personal devotion to Hitler. This is how men like Himmler, a failed chicken farmer, became head of an internal empire of terror. It's how Göring, more concerned with wealth and aesthetics than air superiority, was trusted with the Luftwaffe. It's how yes-men filled the ranks while experienced officers were sidelined, purged, or forced into silence. This cult-of-personality approach crippled German adaptability. Real experts were distrusted. Critical thinking was seen as disloyalty. And when everything fell apart, the people in charge were too incompetent or too terrified to admit it. This top-down dysfunction extended into military planning itself, especially when it came to thinking long-term. 23. Inadequate strategic bombing capability. While the Allies were building fleets of long-range bombers, Lancasters, B-17s, and B-24s capable of devastating industrial targets deep in enemy territory, Germany largely failed to invest in a comparable strategic air force. The Luftwaffe, built for short-term tactical support, was optimized for blitzkrieg, not prolonged bombing campaigns. Germany had no heavy bombers in sufficient numbers. What it had were medium-range aircraft, fine for supporting ground troops, but unable to strike Britain's industrial heartlands or counter Allied bombing raids with equal force. The few strategic bombers Germany experimented with were either canceled, underproduced, or deployed too late to matter. As a result, Germany couldn't disrupt British or Soviet production at scale. Meanwhile, Allied bombers were leveling German cities and war factories week after week. German civilians paid the price, but so did the war effort. And yet, even under bombardment, Hitler and his advisors clung to one comforting belief: surely the Allies would want a deal. 24. Misjudging Allied resolve. The Nazi leadership clung to a fantasy that Britain, and eventually the United States, would be willing to negotiate. They believed the West was weak, materialistic, and afraid of Bolshevism. Surely, once Hitler secured Eastern Europe and frightened them enough, the capitalists would cut a deal, maybe even join forces against Stalin. But Churchill was not negotiating, Roosevelt was not compromising, and Stalin had no intention of stopping short of Berlin. The Allies had learned what Nazi peace looked like: forced labor, occupation, repression. The war wasn't just strategic, it had become moral. Germany would not be appeased, it would be defeated. Yet the Nazi leadership continued to underestimate this resolve, hoping that a breakthrough on the Eastern Front or some wonder weapon would change the equation. It didn't. It never could. And while they were looking westward for peace, they had already lost the South, because they never secured control of a crucial region. 25. Failure to secure Mediterranean dominance. The Mediterranean theater could have been a springboard for Axis power, or a shield against Allied invasion. But Germany never fully committed to it. Italy, under Mussolini, launched half-baked campaigns in North Africa and Greece, which Germany then had to bail out, stretching resources even thinner. Rommel's Africa Corps achieved tactical brilliance, but with minimal support. Supply lines were long, exposed, and reliant on vulnerable shipping routes. Germany never took Malta, the British-held island that served as a thorn in the side of Axis logistics. Without it, Allied aircraft and submarines cut off fuel and reinforcements headed to North Africa. Eventually, the Allies landed in Tunisia, then Sicily, then mainland Italy, turning the Mediterranean into an invasion route into Europe. Germany was forced to divert troops to defend Italy, weakening its eastern and western fronts. And beneath it all was a fatal flaw in thinking. Ideology wasn't just a lens, it was a blindfold. 26. Allowing ideology to override military reality. In most wars, reality eventually overrules fantasy. But in Nazi Germany, the fantasy was the strategy. Intelligence reports were twisted to fit racial theories. Logistics were sidelined in favor of ideological visions. Military priorities were constantly reshaped by Hitler's obsessions with Lebensraum, racial purity, and a mystical war of civilizations. Instead of focusing on defeating armies, the Nazis focused on punishing populations. Military resources were diverted to enforce ideological goals, building camps, transporting prisoners, crushing partisan groups that had been created by the regime's own brutality. Even the timing of offensives was sometimes chosen for symbolic reasons rather than tactical advantage. Allied generals consulted maps and supply lines. Hitler consulted dogma. This turned every military problem into an ideological crusade, and every battlefield into a stage for fantasy. German soldiers weren't just fighting enemies, they were burdened with enforcing a worldview. And while they were doing that, a key strategic opportunity at sea slipped through their fingers. 27. Not prioritizing submarine warfare early enough. Germany's U-boat fleet had the potential to bring Britain to its knees. In the early years of the war, British lifelines, food, fuel, weapons, were almost entirely dependent on shipping. A concentrated large-scale U-boat campaign could have strangled the British Isles long before the Americans entered the war. But Hitler delayed. Resources went elsewhere. The Kriegsmarine received a fraction of the budget that the Luftwaffe devoured. Instead of mass-producing submarines in the late 1930s, Germany prioritized battleships, symbols of power, but largely useless in a modern naval war. When the U-boats were finally prioritized, they came close to success during the happy time of 1940-41. But by then, British countermeasures, convoys, sonar, and air patrols had improved. The Allies turned the tide with intelligence, technology, and numbers. Germany's window of opportunity had closed, and even in areas they did control, the Nazis managed to sabotage themselves, not through battle, but through misrule. 28. Mismanaging occupied economies. Occupation should have brought Germany resources, industry, and labor. Instead, it brought sabotage, inefficiency, and revolt. Rather than stabilizing and extracting value from conquered economies, the Nazis ruled through plunder and terror. Farmland was seized, factories were looted, and workers were enslaved or deported. This wasn't just immoral, it was stupid. Productivity in occupied zones collapsed. Skilled labor fled or resisted. Infrastructure crumbled. In places like Ukraine and Poland, which could have been major food and fuel suppliers, the economy was driven into ruin through short-sighted brutality and incompetence. The Nazis didn't build a war economy across Europe. They dismantled one. Allied bombers weren't the only force damaging German supply lines, so were Nazi policies themselves. The occupied territories became a drag on Germany rather than a boost. But the regime didn't care. They were riding high on early victories and mistaking momentum for mastery. 29. Overconfidence after early victories. In 1939, Germany stormed into Poland in weeks. In 1940, it crushed France in 6. Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, all fell in rapid succession. Hitler's inner circle began to believe their own press, that Germany was unstoppable, invincible, destined to reshape the world, and that belief may have been their most dangerous enemy. Success masked flaws. Logistics were patchy. Planning was rushed. Command structures were chaotic. But early victories created the illusion of genius. Hitler's wildest ideas were accepted without question. No one wanted to be the voice of caution after Paris had fallen in 6 weeks. This overconfidence laid the groundwork for every blunder that followed. The invasion of the USSR, the declaration of war on the US, the refusal to adapt when the war turned against them. All driven by a belief that speed equaled strategy, and luck meant brilliance. And when experienced voices did try to warn them, they were ignored. 30. Ignoring warnings from their own generals. The tragedy wasn't just that mistakes were made, it's that many of them were foreseen. Germany's senior generals, Halder, Guderian, Manstein, Rommel, repeatedly raised concerns about overstretching, supply lines, troop morale, and unrealistic objectives. Their advice was often blunt, tactical, and grounded in years of battlefield experience. But in Hitler's regime, dissent was dangerous. Officers who contradicted the Führer risked demotion, dismissal, or worse. As Hitler's ego inflated with early wins, he increasingly surrounded himself with flatterers. Strategic discussions became monologues. Orders became declarations from on high, immune to criticism. Warnings about winter warfare, ignored. Cautions about splitting forces, rejected. Pleas to retreat from untenable positions, dismissed as cowardice. The generals saw the cracks forming. They just couldn't stop the collapse. And without a culture of honest critique, even science began to fall apart, because coordination and innovation require something Nazi leadership rarely tolerated: cooperation. 31. Failing to coordinate scientific research. Germany had brilliant scientists, rocket engineers, physicists, chemists, and metallurgists, many of them still working within the Reich even after the ideological purges. But having talent isn't enough. You need structure, coordination, shared goals, and above all, leadership that values science as more than just a trophy. What Germany had instead was a fragmented, secretive maze of competing programs. The Army, SS, Luftwaffe, and various ministries all ran their own research initiatives, often duplicating efforts, hoarding information, and jealously guarding breakthroughs. There was no Manhattan Project-style unification, just silos, turf wars, and political favoritism. Promising technologies like jet aircraft, rockets, and advanced weaponry were delayed or poorly integrated. Scientists feared stepping on the wrong toes or receiving the wrong kind of attention from party officials. Funding was erratic, oversight was minimal, and priorities were warped by ideology. Germany had the brainpower. What it lacked was coherence. And as the war dragged on, even its officer corps, once its strongest asset, began to collapse from within. 32. The July 20th, 1944. Aftermath. On July 20th, 1944, a bomb exploded beneath a conference table at Hitler's East Prussian headquarters. The assassination attempt, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg and a group of disillusioned officers, nearly succeeded. But Hitler survived, and the regime responded not with reflection, but revenge. What followed was a purge that decimated what remained of Germany's professional military leadership. Hundreds were executed, imprisoned, or removed from command. These weren't political radicals. They were seasoned officers, many of whom had spent years warning about Hitler's disastrous decisions. Now they were gone. What replaced them were sycophants and fanatics, men chosen for loyalty, not skill. The Wehrmacht lost what was left of its independent judgment. Strategy gave way to obedience. The officer corps, once a source of measured resistance, was now a hollow shell. The failed coup didn't just preserve Hitler's rule, it accelerated the regime's collapse. But instead of facing reality, the leadership chose one final delusion. 33. Refusing negotiation. When defeat was obvious. By late 1944, the war was lost. The Soviets were advancing from the east, the Allies from the west, and Germany's cities were in ruins. Industry crippled, morale collapsing, supplies dwindling. There was no path to victory. Yet Hitler and his inner circle clung to a fantasy of miraculous reversals, superweapons, and last stands. Peace overtures could have saved millions of lives. But ideology forbade surrender. Hitler believed in victory or annihilation. Negotiating meant betraying the myth. And so, even as Allied troops crossed the Rhine and Berlin came within range of Soviet artillery, the regime doubled down, conscripting children, executing dissenters, and pretending the war was still winnable. The final days were not noble. They were wasteful. Cities were flattened, lives were thrown away, and when the end came, it came not with strategy, but with delusion. In the end, the Nazi regime wasn't just defeated. It self-destructed, one blunder, one delusion, and one wasted opportunity at a time. And that, perhaps, is the most fitting ending of all.